He was supposed to laugh. That was the plan. Johnny Carson made a joke on national television, nudged Dean Martin toward a guitar like it was a prop, a punchline, something harmless to fill 3 minutes before commercial break. The audience chuckled on cue. The band smirked. Everyone expected Dean to strum nonsense, slur a lyric, sell the image he'd spent years pretending didn't bother him. But minutes later, Johnny Carson, the unshakable king of late night, the man who never lost control of a room, would be fighting back tears on live television, realizing far too late that he had just opened a door Dean Martin had kept locked for decades. And once that door opened, nothing about the night would go the way it was supposed to. The date was a warm spring evening in the mid-1960s, Studio One at NBC Burbank packed with nearly 300 people, every seat filled, every camera rolling. The Tonight Show was not just a program, it was an institution. Careers were made or broken on that couch. Johnny Carson, 40 years old and already a legend, sat behind his desk like a man born there, suit immaculate, timing flawless, confidence effortless. To America, Johnny was safety. He was the voice that tucked the country into bed after a long day. The man who never let the silence linger too long, never let emotion get messy. Control was his craft, and he guarded it ruthlessly. Dean Martin, by contrast, arrived that night with expectations already set. He was the Rat Pack clown, the smooth crooner who looked half drunk and half unbothered, the guy who seemed to float through life on charm alone. The audience loved him for it. Critics dismissed him for it. Johnny Carson, like many in the industry, thought he knew exactly who Dean Martin was, or at least who he was supposed to be. The producers had penciled him in as a fun guest. Easy laughs, a few Sinatra stories, maybe a joke about drinking. Nothing heavy, nothing real. Backstage, Dean sat alone in the green room, jacket draped over the back of a chair, a guitar case resting quietly against the wall. It hadn't been requested. It wasn't on the rundown. He'd brought it himself, more out of habit than intention. A stagehand passed by, glanced at it, and raised an eyebrow. "You playing tonight?" Dean smiled faintly. "Probably not," he said. And he meant it. At 5:30 p.m. sharp, the band hit the opening theme. Johnny strode out to thunderous applause, delivered a monologue that landed every joke, every pause timed to perfection. He was relaxed, loose, in control. When Ed McMahon announced Dean Martin's name, the room erupted. Dean emerged from behind the curtain with that familiar half-grin, waving casually, as if this was all just another living room he'd wandered into. They shook hands. Johnny quipped. The audience laughed. Everything was exactly as expected. The interview started light. Johnny teased Dean about his liquid lunch reputation. Dean played along, pretending to sip from an imaginary glass, soaking up the laughs. The band punctuated the jokes. On the surface, it was classic television. But there was a moment, small, almost invisible, when Johnny glanced down at his cue cards and decided to push just a little further. He leaned back in his chair, smile widening, voice casual. "You know, Dean," he said, "people always say you've got this guitar talent you never really use. Why don't you pick it up and play something for us?" The line landed as a joke. The audience laughed immediately, assuming this was set up for a gag. Dean laughed too, but his was softer, slower. He glanced off stage, toward the wings, where the guitar case sat just out of sight. For a second, he didn't answer. Johnny filled the silence with a grin. "Unless you're too busy being modest," he added. More laughter. The band chuckled. The pressure was gentle but unmistakable. Dean's smile lingered, but something behind it shifted. He nodded once, stood up, and walked toward the wings without a word. The applause followed him, still playful, still expecting comedy. Johnny leaned back, pleased with himself. This was good television. This was control. But when Dean returned with the guitar in his hands, the energy in the room changed. Just slightly. He didn't sling it on with flair. He didn't crack a joke. He sat down carefully, adjusting the strap, eyes lowered. The applause tapered off unevenly, confused. Johnny noticed the quiet and tried to recover it. "Take your time," he joked. "We've got all night." The audience laughed again, but it sounded thinner now. Dean looked up and said something unexpected. "Mind if we dim the lights a little?" The request was calm, polite, but it wasn't funny. The studio hesitated. Johnny blinked, surprised, then waved it through. "Sure," he said, still smiling, still assuming this was part of the bit. The lights softened. The band fell silent. For the first time that night, Johnny Carson felt something he wasn't used to feeling on his own stage: uncertainty. Dean rested his fingers on the strings, but didn't play right away. He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath taken by someone steadying themselves. The audience shifted in their seats. This was not the Rat Pack routine. This was not Drunk Dean. Somewhere between the desk and the couch, the joke Johnny had made began to dissolve into something else entirely. Something he hadn't planned for. Something he hadn't rehearsed. Johnny glanced toward Ed McMahon, expecting a cue, a lifeline, a signal that this was still safe. Ed just stared back, expression unreadable. The cameras rolled closer. Millions of viewers leaned, and without knowing why, Dean Martin looked out at the audience, then back down at the guitar, and quietly said, "I don't usually play like this." It wasn't a punchline. It was a confession. And in that moment, before a single note had been played, Johnny Carson realized he had miscalculated. The joke had gone too far. The room was no longer his to command. Whatever was about to happen belonged entirely to the man holding the guitar. And as Dean's fingers finally pressed into the strings, Johnny felt a tightening in his chest he couldn't explain, unaware that within minutes, the desk he'd rolled from for years would no longer feel like armor, but a front row seat to something that would undo him on live television. The first note wasn't loud, and it wasn't showy. It was careful, almost hesitant, the sound of someone stepping onto thin ice, and it immediately erased any lingering belief that this was a joke, because Dean Martin did not play like a man performing. He played like a man remembering, his fingers moving slowly across the strings as the studio fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural for a place built on laughter. And Johnny Carson, still half smiling behind his desk, felt that smile stiffen as Dean began to sing in a low, unguarded voice that carried none of his usual swagger, a melody unfamiliar to the band, the audience, even to Johnny himself, a song that didn't aim for applause, but seemed to exist whether anyone was listening or not. And with each line it became clearer that this wasn't something Dean had polished for television. This was something he'd buried, something he'd never meant to share under studio lights, the lyrics drifting toward loss and distance, and time slipping through careless hands. Words that hinted at a father who never believed, a son who was gone too soon, nights spent alone in hotel rooms where the applause couldn't follow, and the audience, trained to react, to clap, to laugh on cue, sat frozen, afraid to break whatever fragile thing was unfolding in front of them, while Johnny leaned forward without realizing it, elbows resting on the desk, eyes locked on Dean with a focus he usually reserved for timing a punchline. Except there was nothing funny here, nothing safe. And as the song deepened, Johnny felt an uncomfortable recognition settle in his chest, because this stripping away of armor, this quiet exposure, was something he himself had spent a lifetime avoiding, hiding behind jokes and monologues and the certainty that control could keep the darkness at bay. And now here was Dean Martin, the man everyone thought coasted through life, standing bare in front of him, voice tightening just slightly on a line that spoke of regret, not enough to crack, but enough to reveal how close it came. And Johnny noticed the audience's faces one by one, grown men with hands clasped, women pressing fingers to their lips, even the cameramen holding their shots longer than usual, afraid to move. And somewhere between the second and third verse, the studio no longer felt like a television set at all, but like a room where something private had accidentally been witnessed, and Johnny's confidence began to drain away, replaced by a sinking realization that the invitation he'd made so casually, so smugly, had pushed Dean into a place no one was supposed to see. And that realization hit hardest when Dean's voice faltered, not dramatically, not enough to stop, just enough to reveal the effort it took to keep going. And Johnny felt his throat tighten in response, his mind flashing uninvited images of his own past, the marriages that failed, the nights he'd gone home to silence after making millions laugh, the fear that without the desk, without the show, there might not be much left. And as Dean reached the final lines of the song, his fingers slowed, letting the notes linger in the air as if reluctant to let them go, the last chord hanging unfinished for a breath too long. And when it finally faded, no one moved, no one clapped, no one spoke, because applause felt wrong, like noise intruding on grief. And Johnny opened his mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. His practiced instincts, abandoning him completely as he turned slightly away from the camera, hand lifting to his face under the pretense of adjusting his tie. Though the cameras caught it anyway, the unmistakable glimmer in his eyes, the blink held a second too long, and the audience realized in real time that the man who never lost composure had been caught off guard by something real. And when the applause finally came, it rose slowly, unevenly, not the roar of entertainment, but the acknowledgement of having witnessed something honest, and Dean nodded once, quietly, lowering the guitar, as if relieved it was over, while Johnny sat there, chest tight, pulse unsteady, knowing that whatever came next, whatever words he found, would not be enough to put the night back where it had started, because the joke was gone, the mask was gone, and in their place sat a truth neither man could ignore anymore. The applause eventually faded, not because it wasn't deserved, but because no one knew what sound was appropriate after something like that. And when the studio finally settled into a fragile quiet, Johnny Carson did something almost unthinkable. He pushed his cue cards aside, the neat stacks sliding across the desk like a quiet surrender, and for a long moment, he simply looked at Dean Martin, not as a guest, not as a punchline, but as a man who had just trusted a room full of strangers with something he'd guarded his entire life. And when Johnny finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, slower, stripped of the rhythm that normally made his words safe, admitting with a small, shaky laugh that the guitar request had been meant as a joke, that he'd expected a laugh, not a reckoning, and the audience leaned in again, sensing that the night still wasn't done, because Johnny, the master of deflection, didn't pivot away or soften it with humor. Instead, he did the one thing he rarely allowed himself to do. He apologized, openly, plainly, telling Dean he had underestimated him, that he'd bought into the same shallow image everyone else had, and that he was sorry for turning something personal into a setup. And Dean listened without interrupting, guitar resting against his knee like a weight finally set down, his expression calm, almost relieved, as if the apology mattered less than the honesty behind it. And when he responded, his voice carried no bitterness, only a quiet clarity, explaining that the song wasn't planned, that he didn't usually play like that because it hurt, because once you open certain doors, it's hard to close them again, and that tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt like the right moment. And Johnny nodded, eyes damp but steady now, confessing in return that he'd spent years hiding behind jokes because being funny was easier than being honest, because control felt safer than vulnerability, and that watching Dean stand there had made him realize how rarely he allowed himself, or anyone else, that kind of space, and the exchange, unscripted and unpolished, seemed to suspend time itself. Two men at the height of fame admitting, in front of millions, that success hadn't protected them from loss or loneliness or regret. And when Johnny finally closed the segment, there was no punchline, no band sting, just a quiet thank you and a handshake that lingered longer than television etiquette usually allowed. The audience, rising to its feet not out of excitement, but out of respect, aware they had witnessed something that would never be replicated. And in the days that followed, letters poured into NBC by the thousands, viewers writing about watching the episode in stunned silence, about seeing their own hidden grief reflected on a late-night stage, critics calling it one of the most human moments in television history, and behind the scenes, Johnny was changed by it, staff noticing he treated guests differently. Afterward, less eager to corner them into jokes, more willing to let silences breathe, while Dean, when asked later about the performance, brushed it off with his usual shrug, saying only that sometimes a song has to come out whether you're ready or not. And years later, when clips of the moment were replayed and analyzed, people would focus on the image of Johnny Carson turning away from the camera, eyes wet. The illusion of control finally cracked, understanding at last that the power of that night wasn't in the music alone, but in the reminder that even the men who make America laugh carry songs they're afraid to play, and that once in a rare while, a careless joke can open a door to truth neither side ever expected, but would never forget.